protection. No, my darling, rain always goes away, but keep a little something hidden where your friends can't see it, and never let them know it's there. And off she sailed to deal with the enemy, and because I loved to do things for her, but also because even at that age I knew she would bundle everything back untidily. And untidiness meant muddle and consequent scoldings from Bella. I began to pick up the scattered papers. I thought my beautiful mother would be pleased, but when she came back her glance went to my hands and her face paled. In one swift movement she snatched the papers away, and I stared in amazement, for I could see no reason why she should swoop so agitatedly upon a bundle of bills and some old picture torn from a periodical. Some time after that the atmosphere in the house changed again. It all started with a newsboy shouting in the street. My mother, who had been silent all day, sat tautly behind the lace curtains of the first-floor drawing-room, but seeing nothing beyond them, suddenly leaped to her feet and called to Michelle to go quickly, quickly, whereupon Michelle raced downstairs and out to the newsboy. A moment later she was back, smiling and exciting, and my mother, waiting rigid as a statue, came sharply to life and cried, "Acquitted? He's been acquitted?" Michelle nodded and held out the paper. I saw bold headlines which I could not read, and a man's face which was familiar because I had often seen it right here in this house. I saw the news sheet go flying, as with one triumphant sweep of her arm my mother hurled it aside, laughing and crying at the same time. "He has been lucky, madame, lucky. It would have been manslaughter, imprisonment, or worse." "Never! Not for Lucky Jack!" "It was self-defense, anyway. What other verdict could there possibly be?" She seized me then and danced me around the room, singing and laughing, wild with joy. "We must celebrate. A champagne party. Tell Bella at once. And a new gown. I must have a new gown to welcome him back. I saw a divine thing in the Bond Street the other day. Pearl gray satin billowing over hoops, with tiers of lace in the softest Parma violet, and a superb sash of deep purple velvet trailing to the floor at the back, and shoulder drapes falling from a deep, deep neckline, the kind he loves me to wear." "And the price, madame?" Michelle asked dryly. "Prices are never displayed on gowns like that. Just one superb model, in an exclusive modiste's window. It is probably outlandish, but who cares? This time tomorrow I shall be wearing it. This time tomorrow he will be here again." "And these?" With typical French practicality, Michelle indicated the batch of unpaid bills. "They will still be here, madame. And buying a costly gown won't help to settle them. Besides, at the moment your credit is not good." "But the modiste in Bond Street doesn't know that. I have never dealt there before." Laughter rippled through the room, and the unpaid bills were torn into shreds and thrown into the air like a cloud of snowflakes. And I laughed too, swept up on the tide of my mother's happiness. She bought the gown. She gave the champagne party. People came back, all the old familiar faces, but his was not amongst them. I did see him, some time later, again in a news sheet. Bella had it in the kitchen and was trying to hide it. "You can't, Michelle. She will have to know sometime. Better now while she is alone than when friends can see her." Bella handed over the paper reluctantly. "What is it?" I demanded. "What are you going to show Mama? Let me see." "Why shouldn't she?" shrugged Bella when Michelle tried to withhold it. "The mite's too young to understand." It was a beautiful picture, the picture of a bride dressed all in white. She stood within the entrance of a church, holding on to the arm of her bridegroom. I recognized him at once as the man known as Lucky Jack, the man who had come regularly to our house for so long that even I guessed it was not merely the gambling that drew him, but my mother. Sometimes I even wondered whether he would replace my father in her life, although secretly I believe no man ever really could. I knew all about my father, of course. His name was Eustace Rochdale, which was why I was called Eustacia. My mother had eloped with him at the age of 17. It was the sort of romantic thing my mother would do. Life in a country parsonage was too dull for me, darling, and your father was so handsome, so persuasive. It was love at first sight, I do assure you. My father had been a soldier, brave as well as handsome. He had died a soldier's death when I was little more than a babe in arms. This was the story my mother told me when childish curiosity made me wonder why I had no father as other children had. She told the story simply and without embellishments, and in so doing she gave me the hero forevermore, a father to be proud of, so that I felt superior to the other children who walked in Hyde Park after church on Sundays with their tightly laced mothers and stiff-collared fathers, tall-hatted, cravated, bespattered men who worked at dull jobs in the city, unadventurous and unheroic. Spats. I would look at them contemptuously, mentally comparing them with a guardsman's military boots, for of course I knew without asking that my father had been in the Guards. But my mother gave me something more than a hero for a father. She gave me a romantic love story to dream about and cherish. Eustace Rochdale had swept her off her feet, rescuing her from a life of imprisonment in a narrow-minded household, with all the bravura of a knight rescuing a princess from a tower. No conventional wedding for them. My love, my father would never have consented. A sedate curate, yes, preferably well-born and well-connected, who might ultimately become a bishop, but a dashing soldier? Never. So we eloped, and I never regretted it. Very characteristic of my mother to do the unconventional thing, and take the consequences without complaint. Never did she bemoan her lot. Although widowed when little more than 20, with a baby to support, and precious little to do on it. Never blame your father for leaving me unprovided for, Stacy. He died young, and he did his best. He also taught me a lot, and for that I am grateful. As she said this, her long tapering fingers flicked through a deck of cards with the rapidity of an expert. She used to practice daily, and I would watch, fascinated, as she cut the deck into 2 halves, then set the gilt edges into a flying pattern of gold, interleaving them like a pair of fans until they were welded into one pack again. Over and over. Cut, fan, flick. Brr, shuffle. Weld, deal. All like lightning, faster and faster, until it was impossible to separate the motions of her supple fingers from the speed of the cards. But she would never teach me. There were other things more enjoyable to do. Walking in the park, for instance. Be the weather wet or fine, warm or cold, my mother was fond of walking, perhaps because she had been brought up in the country, but also she once told me because it cleared away the cobwebs. I thought she meant the cobwebs which Bella ignored about the house, and which she, who was so fastidious about her clothes and her toilet, surprisingly overlooked as well. But eventually I learned what the expression really meant, and that this was the reason why she always went walking in Regent's Park the day following particularly late night, returning refreshed and ready for another. But also, she told me, walking preserved the figure. Without exercise, a woman grew fat, and this she was determined never to do. So saying, she would look down at her flat stomach and slim hips with satisfaction, and walk along with the swinging step that drew men's eyes. She was tall, and her back was straight and slender, her waist so narrow that it scarcely needed lacing. At home she frequently abandoned hoops. They were a nuisance, she said, and fashion must ultimately discard them for more practical skirts like those of the Regency, long and slim and elegant. She wore house gowns on similar lines, softly outlining her figure. Some of her friends pretended to be shocked, but they copied her nonetheless. In these clinging gowns she would relax even to the extent of crossing her legs when lounging at ease in our drawing room. That was when I saw the eyes of the men lingering on the outline of her thighs and upon the gentle swelling of her breasts, above her low-cut bodice. It seemed then as if her old body were laid bare, and at such moments something disturbed and vaguely frightened me. She became a woman I did not know. I wanted to shout at those men to turn their eyes away. Instead, I would slip quietly out of the room, aware that I was unnoticed. But my mother had every reason to be proud of her figure, and I had every reason to be proud of her as we walked along together. She would hold my hand, and I would dance along beside her, or she would let me run free across the grass, without even my bonnet or gloves on. I knew that other children walking sedately with gray uniformed nannies or quietly bowling hoops envied me. Sometimes my mother ran with me, pulling off her hat too and forgetting to be a lady. I adored her at those moments, and would shout in delight when she swung me off my feet and whirled me around, not caring tuppence for the disapproving glances of sedate matrons. But on wet days we kept to the paths. She was strict about that, as she was about my being well wrapped up in cold weather. Throughout my childhood I was aware of one dominant thing, my mother's protective feeling for me. It was as if everything she did, whatever she did, had one primary aim and purpose: to give me all the things she considered best, and to shield me from others. It was during one of our walks that Michelle came into our lives, and little did I dream how important she was to become to both of us, particularly to me. The rain was heavy, which meant that we had to keep to the paths, and I had to be content with making squelchy sounds with my galoshes, my mother joining in the fun by making squelchy sounds with hers. She had a way of making a game of everything. She laughed at life, and laughed at it even more after she saw Lucky Jack's wedding picture. But it became hard, brittle laughter for the most part, except when she was alone with me. But this particular day preceded that one by many months, and the bitter note that I began to recognize in her laughter as I grew older was absent then. We ran head down against the rain in a wind driving too hard for umbrellas, which was why I stumbled over a park bench and the wet bundle of humanity lying upon it. My mother stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the prostrate human being. Then she sat down and lifted the rain-soaked head onto her lap, smoothing back the sodden hair and murmuring in concern. When my mother looked like that, full of pity and tenderness, she was at her most beautiful. I knew that for the moment she had forgotten me, but I didn't mind. I too was staring at the ashen face, and I went on staring at it all the way home in the hansom cab, which my mother went hurrying to fetch, leaving me beside the wet bundle as if mounting guard, then commanding a reluctant cabby to lift the inert figure into his vehicle and into our house upon arrival. That was how Michelle came to our home and stayed there, nursed back to health with warmth, good food, medicines, and kindness. There were workhouses for creatures like this, the doctor said, the poor souls not likely to recover from pneumonia. She could be taken there to die. And be buried in a pauper's grave? My mother flung back at him, as she snatched up her reticule and emptied out all the money she had. Whoever she is, whatever she is, she's a human being. Do the best you possibly can for her, and if there isn't enough money there, I will find more. She needs constant nursing, Mrs. Rochdale. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. Night and day. Bella and I will take turns. Do you know what you are undertaking, Mrs. Rochdale? Yes, I'm trying to save this poor girl's life, and I thought that was the doctor's mission too. He had the grace to look embarrassed, but he picked up the money and pocketed it even so, saying it would be enough to go on with. For a long time afterward, until I met Nicholas Bly, I thought that doctors assessed a human life in terms of money. As he left the house that day, the doctor said to my mother somewhat apologetically, "You're a good woman, Mrs. Rochdale," at which he laughed heartily, flinging back her dark head, as she always did when amused, white teeth flashing. "You're the first man who's ever said that to me." Michelle Dubois was a lady's maid, of no fixed abode, without a penny in her pocket. She had come from Clermont-Ferrand to work in one of the fine Nash houses on the outer perimeter of Regent's Park. She had lost the job and couldn't get back to France. "Why? Were you dismissed without wages?" "Yes, madame." "That means you had committed some misdemeanor." A questioning glance in the dark eyes, which now looked back from a pale but reviving face. "You did something wrong," my mother explained. "So they did. So they said, madame." "And were they right?" Hesitation, a flickering glance at my mother's clear and knowledgeable eyes, the realization that to lie was a useless, reluctant nod. "So the agency, I presume you came to this country through one of those, new and dubious domestic agencies that brings girls over from the continent, would take no responsibility for you? Women come to this sort of pass all the time, in all sorts of ways, in this grand and glorious age of ours. The streets of London harbour them in their thousands, destitute and desperate. That is why it is known as the whore shop of the world. My mother touched the white cheek compassionately. You have been with us for several weeks now. You're getting better every day. As soon as you are well enough to travel, I will pay your fare home. Non, madame. There was terror now. So you are afraid to go back? Why? Would your family not accept you? What did you do, mademoiselle? Sleep with the master of the house? Or the son of the house? Are you going to have a child? An emphatic and confident denial. I can believe that. It was a stupid question, because obviously being so ill you would have lost it. So it must have been something worse. Something for which you have been convicted? Was it theft, perhaps? Another denial, but less convincing. I was wrongly accused, madame. Silence. The small gilt clock on my mother's bedroom mantelpiece ticked busily. For someone who was ill, the best bed and the most comfortable room had been allocated as a matter of course. If you and I are to get along together, my mother said firmly, we must understand each other. Which means you must never lie to me, mademoiselle. Were you wrongly accused? The eyes in the pale face flickered again, looked down, and then up, grew steady and honest. No, madame. What did you steal? A brooch, madame. A small gilt brooch. Her ladyship never wore it. It was there, tossed into a trinket box. She kept worthless things in that box. And when asked to give presents to charity, she would take some out without even looking at them, and have them parceled and sent away. So I thought she would never even miss it. It was such a little brooch. What I did was wrong, I know, but I could not stop myself. I never can. So you'd done it before? Silence again, another nod. At home in France. Until you could no longer get work there, so came to England where French maids are in demand? It is a familiar story, mademoiselle. And oh, so sad. And now you are afraid to go home because your family would have no sympathy. I would be turned away, madame. My mother is ashamed of me. She has kept house in the Curé since I was a baby. How could she expect a priest to open his doors to me again? He used to make me do penance each time harder than before, right from the time I went to the convent to be educated. It was at the convent that I began taking things belonging to other girls. Just little things, madame, so that I will feel the same as they. When I was expelled, Father Clement tried to help me. 6 times a day he prayed with me, asking the good Lord to drive out my wickedness and the Blessed Virgin to intercede for my soul. Also, when he rose at dawn for meditation, I had to rise too and go to church without having food first, and kneel on the stone floor with my feet and bare legs until he gave me permission to rise, sometimes for as long as 2 hours or more, if his holy thoughts absorbed him. Suffering, he said, would help to save me from perdition. He was very good to me. So it seems, my mother answered dryly. I don't wonder you are afraid to go back. And I thought an English parsonage bad enough. A parsonage, madame? What is that? Something not so bad as your noble curé's house, you poor child. I, at least, never suffered physically. I merely stifled. The subject was changed quickly. So you like pretty things. Well, that's natural enough. But my premonitions are not natural, madame. The things I see, the things I sense. For these, too, I was punished, and no one believed me when I swore they came to me like visions. For a moment there seemed to be a stillness in the room, almost a sense of chill. Then my mother said lightly, Don't tell me you are a psychic, mademoiselle. Do you foretell the future, too? If so, spare me, for the future is something I never wish to think about. Live in the moment, forget the past, never worry about what is to come. That is my creed, and I advise you to share it. Her petticoats rustled as she swept across the room, unlocked a drawer in her dressing table, and took out a jeweled case. With her back to the bed, she unlocked it. and then carried it across to the girl. These, mademoiselle, are my jewels. I know each and every one of them. I wouldn't give one away to charity because I consider that begins at home. I am showing them to you to prove that I trust you. She locked the case again. And this is where I keep the key. She dropped it down the neckline of her gown, in the little valley between her breasts, and laughed. You'd find it difficult to get hold of it there, wouldn't you? And at night it is concealed in my room, this room, from which you will be moving shortly. I might mention, mademoiselle, that I am not always alone at night. Of course not, said the girl, understanding something I did not. Madame is very beautiful. Naturally she would not be alone at night. I was puzzled. What had beauty to do with it? When 3 people shared a house, Mamma, myself, and Bella, none of us was alone. Grown-up talk was often confusing. But all my mother said was, good. I think we understand each other. If you want pretty things, you must work for them. Work well, and I will see that you have them. Dark-ringed eyes looked enormous. Work, madame? You mean that you will be staying with us, of course. Do you imagine I would turn you out on the streets again? When I have money, which is when the cards go well, you will be paid good wages. At other times, you will be fed and have a home. In return, my mother laughed gaily, I have always wanted a French maid. It adds to one's social prestige, of which, alas, I have little. Besides, French ladies' maids have talent with the needle and with the hair. That is so, is it not? Mais oui, madame. I am skilled as a dressmaker. The good sisters taught me well. They also taught me to speak English, although it was not so good when I first came to this country. And so that I should qualify as a really skilled lady's maid and obtain good employment, Maman sent me to be trained by a good coiffeuse. I can cut, style, do anything with the hair, madame. Splendid, and don't worry about the times when your wages may not be paid. They will be few and far between, I promise, for I make sure the cards go well. I am a skilled player. I use my brains. Only sometimes it is tactful to let others win. Michel nodded solemnly. It was as if right from the beginning there was a rapport between those two, which made explanations unnecessary. Who was your last employer, Michel? You refer to her as your ladyship? She may be known to me. Lady Chalford, madame. The words came a trifle apprehensively, as if Michel were afraid that her ladyship might be approached for a reference, and this sudden good fortune come to an abrupt end. But my mother's explosive laughter chased any lingering fear away. Letitia Chalford? By all that's wonderful, have no fear, she is no friend of mine. But her husband is. I know Lady Chalford by sight, of course. Everyone does. Good-looking, I grant you. She is famed for her clothes, and her style, and her hair, and for being the greatest snob in London. But now I know she is a fool as well. A good French maid is worth more than a paltry brooch. Here, take this. Impulsively my mother unpinned a small silver brooch from the wide lace collar at her shoulders and fastened it on Michel's nightdress, brushing away the girl's incoherent thanks, with the remark that it was of little value, otherwise she wouldn't be giving it away. Besides, you poor thing, you deserve some compensation for suffering destitution on the London streets. God knows what experiences you had before illness overtook you. A thin hand came out from beneath the coverlet and seized my mother's. It was kissed with passionate gratitude. Don't, my dear, don't. There is nothing in this world that I would not do for you, madame. All I ask is that you dress my hair as beautifully as you dressed Lady Chalford's, and that you teach my little Stacy to speak French as perfectly as you do. My parsonage instruction was woefully inadequate, but you speak your language as it should be spoken, I can tell. I suppose that is a result of being brought up in the curé's home. Sadist and hypocrite he might be, but he must have been well educated and well spoken, and I have no doubt that the sisters at the convent were equally so. I am not ambitious for myself, Michel, nor am I a social climber, but for my daughter I want the best of everything. And so Michel became part of our household, and my constant companion. She loved my mother, but as time passed, perhaps she loved me more, at any rate in a different way. She became protective, forever on guard for me. She gave her loyalty and gratitude to my mother, and fulfilled every obligation to her. Since it was Madame's wish that her daughter should speak French fluently, Michel made sure that I did. In time, we talked to each other almost exclusively in that language. It wasn't until I went to school that I realized why I never really got to know the local children, and even then I didn't grasp the truth until it was unwittingly thrust into my face by a pupil who lived in one of the grander houses in Gordon Square. Her name was Prudence Halford. The school was a private one, run by a couple of spinster ladies who knew more about good manners and deportment than about scholastic subjects. I think they accepted me as a pupil for 2 reasons. First, because they needed the fees, and second, because my French was so fluent that they would be able to pass me off as an example of their excellent tuition in that language, which I quickly recognized as being inferior. The fact that I was brought to school each day by a French maid that also impressed them, although I felt they looked askance at my beautiful mother, resplendent in dark green velvet and sables, the day she enrolled me. But after school, Prue would steal her parents' keys, and we would spend long sessions there, giggling and exchanging confidences, mimicking Mrs. Mortimer, sharing secrets, all the things that young girls do. But today, Prue was in no mood for fun. I was waiting, as usual, by the gate, and was puzzled because she didn't come racing out of her house as she always did, holding her skirts high above flounced petticoats. Instead, she dragged her feet, in their buttoned cloth-topped boots, slowly down the steps and across the road, kicking fallen leaves until they swirled around her ankles. She looked glum and unsmiling. As soon as we were in the gardens, we went straight to what we called our secret place, a small grassy area hidden within a dusty shrubbery. Whereupon she flung herself down and burst into tears. It was then she declared that she wanted no birthday party if I couldn't be there. Because my answer seemed to pass unheeded, I shook her by the shoulder and repeated it. Of course I've come. I just told you. She turned her head away as if unable to look me in the eye and then blurted, You can't. You're not invited. It was like a slap in the face. But you promised. I know I did, and I meant it, but Mama says no. Prue's tear-stained face and unhappy eyes suddenly made me feel more sorry for her than for myself. And since I was, on the whole, of a logical turn of mind, there seemed to me to be only one explanation. It must be because enough have been invited already, I said, swallowing my disappointment. Bella always says she can cater for just so many and no more. I expect your mother thinks the same. I would be one too many. Oh, no, it isn't that, Prue answered with brutal honesty of the young. It's because of who you are. I mean, your mother, what she is. Mama says because that none of the other girls would be allowed to come if it became known that Luella Rochdale's daughter had been invited. But I said you can't be blamed for what your mother does. My body went taut. What do you mean? Sorry about that. Let's see. Well, everybody knows, don't they? The whole neighborhood has known for years, Mama says, about the gambling salon which the police pretend not to know about. Because, after all, it only seems she gives card parties. Oh, and why shouldn't she give card parties? Oh, Stacy, it isn't only that. The men she entertains, and the things that happen. Like the time 2 men fought over her, and one was shot. My mother says Luella Rochdale doesn't only make money by cheating at cards, but by taking men to bed with her. I flung out my arm and struck Prue across the face, and then I went pelting towards the iron gate and out into the square. I didn't stop running until I reached home. The front door was shut, and I didn't bother to pull the iron bell, but raced down the area steps and into the basement kitchen. I heard Bella cry out in surprise, but I went on through the kitchen and up the stairs into the hall. Up again to the drawing room floor, where I halted briefly, glancing inside and finding the room empty. So was the little morning room behind it. "Where is she? Where's my mother?" I cried. It's Charlie. "Come back here, Miss Stacy. You come back here." I heard the note of panic in Bella's voice, and that spurred me on. The bedroom, her bedroom. I raced up the stairs again. And at the top, Michelle appeared, took one look at me, and tried to block my way. I thrust her aside. I heard her cry out, "Don't go in there, Cherie!" But it was too late. I had the door open. My mother lay on a tumbled bed, relaxed and drowsy. She was half propped against a pillow, and was smiling sleepily at a man seated upon a window seat. He was wearing a robe, his back to the afternoon light. I couldn't see his face. I didn't want to. I stared only at my mother, her furrow round bare breasts and long firm thighs, her flat belly and curving hips. Somewhere at the back of my mind, I was shocked. The thought registered that she looked like one of those naked women in one saw in an art gallery, painted on canvas or sculptured in marble, except that she was warm flesh. A drift of heat and perfume came to me from the bed, the perfume she always wore, but which she had applied more liberally than usual. I was 12 and too innocent to realize that the atmosphere in the room was that of satiated sex. All I knew was that something had taken place between these two, something intimate and private which shut me out of her life. I felt sickened and angry because I had been too blind to see that the whole neighborhood had guessed it, and talked about it for years. But stronger still was the shock of discovering that there was a side to my mother about which I knew nothing. The man drawled, "My dear Luella, how stupid of you not to lock the door." My mother turned her head lazily, saying it was a nuisance having to get up to admit Bella with the tea, but she broke off abruptly at the sight of me. She covered her nakedness swiftly, but in that moment I was out of the room and racing upstairs to my own, slamming the door and turning the key violently behind me. Michelle kept knocking at my door, pleading to let me in, to let her talk to me. Bella tried also, ordering me to open up and stop sulking. "You didn't ought to go barging into your ma's room like that. Come on now, ducks. Unlock this there door and let old Bella in. I got a nice cup of tea." I remained silent and dry-eyed, sitting on the side of my bed, aware only of bewilderment and shock. I knew the shock to be unreasonable, because as long as I could remember, I had seen men fall in love with my mother, and she with them. But her overprotective attitude toward me had kept me in blissful ignorance of anything more than that. She seemed incongruous now, because I had already heard sniggering schoolgirl remarks, when Mrs. Mortimer were safely out of earshot, about what a man and woman did when they were married. "They take all their clothes off when they go to bed," Prue had whispered, which seemed shocking to me. I remembered feeling glad that my mother wasn't married, because there was no man to make her do such a thing. When my mother went to bed, she wore beautiful night dresses. I had seen them, but now I realized that with a jolt that a woman could go to bed with a man even if she were not married, and disrobe for him. But what happened after that I refused to wonder about. I only knew instinctively that the man in the robe had been enjoying my mother's body in some way, and I hated him. Memory pierced my mind with forgotten fragments. My mother's voice saying, "I might mention, Mademoiselle, that I am not always alone at night," and Michelle nodding and understanding, saying, that Madame was very beautiful, so naturally she would not be. But I had been, how old, 5 or less? And the significance of the words had been beyond me. I also remembered the long, meaningful, appraising glances of men as they eyed the curves of my mother's body, and my childish anger with them for doing so, and the total unawareness on her part, as well as theirs, when I quietly slipped away. Now I crossed the gulf between childhood and young womanhood in one bound, bitterly resenting the fact that my mother had tried to present one picture of herself to me and hidden another. But dominant above all was a sickening thrust of Prue's words. My mother says Luella Rochdale doesn't only make money by cheating at cards, but by taking men to bed with her. A chasm of unsuspected knowledge spread out before me, and as I recoiled from it, I heard my mother's voice commanding me to open the door. It was calm and authoritative, and because I had always obeyed her, I did so automatically. I turned the key, then moved quickly away, leaving her to open the door for herself. That gave me time to reach the window and stare out across the rooftops, my back to her. "So you don't want to look at me, Eustacia?" I made no answer. She closed the door. "If you do, you will see no difference in me. I am still your mother. I love you as I have always loved you, and always will." She waited a moment, then said, "Please turn round, Eustacia." And although she put it as a request, I knew it was really an order, and I obeyed, wishing I had the courage to refuse. There must have been something in my face which caused that sharp catch in her breath as she murmured, "You poor child, I should have spared you this." "You should never have spared me, Mamma. If I had always known, if I had grown up being used to it, it wouldn't have mattered." "You mean you would have accepted it as a part of life?" Her shoulders rose and fell in a shrug, which was half bewilderment, half resigned. "Perhaps you are right. I am not a good mother, but I do try. And I've always thought that being part of a good mother was to protect a child from seeing or knowing things which you had no desire for them to see or know. But now I realize that their shock is greater than when they find out. I know men fall in love with you, Mamma. I've always known it, because I've seen it happen. I've heard the way they speak to you and the way they look at you, and sometimes you have only seen them and not me, so I've guessed you loved them in return. I used to wonder if you would marry one of them, but was glad when you didn't. I liked having you to myself." "And now you feel you haven't?" She was no longer talking to me as if I was a child, nor was I talking to her as a child. Those days had gone abruptly. "Believe me, Stacy, things are unchanged between us, but I should have prevented this afternoon." "You mean prevented what happened when I was out, or prevented me from discovering?" "In that case you should have locked the door, even if it meant the bother of letting Bella in with the tea." My voice cracked on a high note. I saw her flinch and was glad. I saw her sit down slowly, a quiet but elegant woman wearing a quiet but elegant dress, her lovely hair piled on top of her head as regal as a queen. She was as remote from the naked woman upon that tumbled bed as I was remote from Prue's respectable world. "Eustacia, I must make you understand you are growing up." "I am grown up. At 12, that is still childhood." "But not to me." The tears and the hysteria that I held in check were threatening me now. If I were a child, I wouldn't understand what it means when someone tells you that your mother not only makes money by cheating at cards, but by taking men to bed with her. Color drained from her face so quickly that